The neighborhood of North Street in Daytona Beach is the kind of place where people notice the small things. The sound of a lawnmower, the arrival of the mail, or the sudden, unexplained absence of a neighbor. But in July 2017, the most notable thing about the small home belonging to 55-year-old Jeffrey Albertsman wasn't a sound at all. It was the silence. It was a silence so heavy that it finally compelled his mother to pick up the phone and call the Volusia County authorities. She hadn't heard from her son in over a week. For a man who stayed in regular contact with his family, that week was an eternity. It was the first breadcrumb in a trail that would lead investigators into one of the most disturbing scenes in the history of the Daytona Beach Police Department. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. When the officers arrived on that sweltering July day, the Florida heat was oppressive, pushing 90 degrees with humidity that made the air feel thick enough to breathe. Outside the home, Jeffrey's family was waiting. They were anxious, standing in the sun, watching the front door that remained stubbornly locked. There were no signs of a break-in, no shattered glass, no forced frames. The house looked perfectly normal from the curb, but the air around the perimeter was beginning to change. As officers approached the threshold, they were met with a scent that every veteran cop knows but never gets used to. The sweet, cloying, unmistakable odor of advanced decomposition. The fire department was called to assist with entry. They didn't use a battering ram. They wedged the door open carefully, as if trying not to disturb whatever was waiting on the other side. As the door gave way, the well-being check officially ended and a homicide investigation began. The body camera footage from the initial entry captures the frantic clicking of flashlights and the heavy breathing of officers through their masks. They moved through the living room and toward the back of the house, their beams of light cutting through the dim interior. In the bathroom, they found him. Jeffrey Albertsman was slumped in the tub, his body ravaged by the heat and the passage of time. The initial visual was so overwhelming that the officers had to retreat momentarily. But as the scene was secured and the initial shock wore off, the investigators realized this wasn't just a sudden death or a standard homicide. The body was incomplete. Jeffrey had been shot once in the back of the head, an execution-style wound, but the post-mortem treatment of his remains was what truly horrified the department. His arms and legs had been removed. The bathroom, a small and cramped space, had become a makeshift workshop for a killer who was either incredibly cold-blooded or meticulously organized. There was no sign of a struggle in the rest of the house, suggesting Jeffrey never saw it coming. He had been taken out in his own sanctuary, and then, while the world outside continued its business on North Street, someone had stayed behind. Someone had spent hours in that house with a saw or a knife, disarticulating the man he once was. As the police began to process the scene, the focus shifted from the what to the who. While the forensic teams in white suits began the grim task of documenting the bathroom, a detective stepped outside to speak with the family and neighbors. Almost immediately, one name began to surface. It wasn't the name of a local gang member or a known criminal. It was the name of the woman Jeffrey had been involved with for nearly a decade, Nelsie Tetley. Neighbors hadn't seen Jeffrey, but they had seen her. A neighbor, standing just feet away from the crime scene tape, told officers that they had seen Nelsie at the house just 24 hours before the police arrived. She hadn't looked distressed. She hadn't looked like a woman who had just discovered her boyfriend's mutilated body. She had simply pulled up in her car, walked to the mailbox, retrieved the mail, and used her own key to enter the home. She stayed for 15 minutes, long enough to look around, long enough to breathe in the scent of what was in that bathroom, and then she simply walked out, got back in her car, and drove away. This revelation changed the timeline entirely. If Jeffrey had been dead for over a week, as the decomposition suggested, then Nelsie Tetley had been visiting a morgue. She had been entering a house where her boyfriend lay dismembered and was acting as if she were merely stopping by to check the utility bills. The police now had a primary suspect, but they were missing a massive piece of the puzzle. They had a torso and a head, but the rest of Jeffrey, his limbs, were nowhere to be found in the house. The killer hadn't just cut him apart. They had taken pieces of him away. As the sun began to set on the first day of the investigation, the detectives looked at Nelsie's history. They found a woman who was nearly 70 years old, a grandmotherly figure to some, but a woman with a record of extreme domestic violence. They found a man who had been living in fear, a man who had tried to leave, and a woman who refused to let him go. But as they dug into her past, they realized that the gruesome scene on North Street wasn't just an isolated outburst of rage. It looked like a repeat performance. The detectives began to look at a cold case from 2007, 10 years prior, involving another man who had vanished while dating Nelsie. His name was Michael Lewis, and as the two cases began to blur together, the police realized they weren't just looking for a murderer. They were looking for a woman who might have been carrying a dark, dismembered secret for an entire decade. But even with Nelsie in their sights, they still had to find where she had hidden the rest of Jeffrey. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The discovery of Jeffrey Albertsman's torso in his North Street home was only the beginning of a forensic nightmare. While the Daytona Beach Police Department secured the residence, a secondary, more grueling search began. The killer had been meticulous, but they had also been burdened. To remove 4 human limbs from a crime scene requires a level of physical effort and a specific destination. Detectives knew that somewhere in the vast, swampy terrain of Volusia County, Jeffrey's missing remains were hidden. The task of finding them in the thick Florida brush would have been nearly impossible if not for a breakthrough in digital forensics. Investigators obtained a warrant for Nelsie Tetley's cellular records, looking for any pings that deviated from her normal routine. What they found was a digital trail leading directly away from the city and toward the rural outskirts of the county. On the days following Jeffrey's presumed disappearance, Nelsie's phone had traveled approximately 45 minutes west to an area known as the Fernery, a dense, wooded section of a state park. While Nelsie was telling neighbors and family members that Jeffrey had simply moved to New York to start a new life, her phone was sitting in the middle of a forest. In September 2017, 2 months after the initial discovery, the digital trail was confirmed by a physical one. Workers clearing brush in the Fernery stumbled upon a sight that stopped them in their tracks. Scattered in the undergrowth were skeletal remains. When the medical examiner arrived, the grim reality was confirmed. These were the missing limbs of Jeffrey Albertsman. But it wasn't just the location that mattered. It was the way the limbs had been separated from the body. The autopsy of the limbs and the torso revealed a chilling level of precision. This wasn't a frenzied attack with a hatchet or a haphazard hack job. The medical examiner noted sharp force alterations that were consistent with anatomical disarticulation. In layman's terms, the person who did this knew exactly where the joints were. They had navigated the hips, knees, and elbows with the steady hand of someone who understood the mechanics of the human body. The cuts were made with a manually powered implement, most likely a heavy-duty kitchen knife or a handsaw, and they were performed with such clinical focus that it suggested the killer had spent a significant amount of time finishing the task. As the forensic reports were finalized, detectives began to overlay Jeffrey's case with the files of a man named Michael Lewis. In November 2007, Michael had been Nelsie Tetley's boyfriend. He had vanished without a trace, and for a month, Nelsie had maintained a story similar to the one she told about Jeffrey, that he had simply walked away from the relationship. When Michael's body was eventually found in a wooded area of a state park in Ormond Beach, the similarities were too stark to ignore. Michael Lewis had also been dismembered. His limbs had been removed at the exact same joint points as Jeffrey's. The manual power used to sever the bone and tissue was identical. Most hauntingly, while Jeffrey's head was left with his torso, Michael's head had been completely removed and was never recovered. The 2007 case had gone cold because of a lack of physical evidence linking Nelsie to the act. But in 2017, the signature of the killer was undeniable. The medical examiner concluded that an association between the two dismemberments could not be excluded. It was the same blueprint executed by the same hands 10 years apart. Detectives now had a forensic link, but they still needed to break Nelsie's alibi. When she was brought in for questioning, she was remarkably composed for a woman in her late 60s facing a double murder investigation. She didn't deny her presence at Jeffrey's house, but she claimed she was there out of love. She told investigators that she had been checking on him because she was worried. She claimed that when she arrived at the house and smelled the dead animal odor, She assumed he had just left some trash out. She never explained why. If she were so worried, she didn't call the police or use her key to check the bathroom. She pushed a narrative that Jeffrey was a drug user who had associated with dangerous people. She claimed that 2 men from the street had shown up looking for money, and she had simply fled to protect herself. But when police searched her own apartment and her car, the worried girlfriend persona began to crumble. They found 3 keys. One unlocked Jeffrey's front door, the door she claimed she couldn't open. Another unlocked Jeffrey's car. The most damning evidence, however, wasn't a key or a phone ping. It was a witness from Nelsie's own apartment complex. A neighbor reported that a week before the police found Jeffrey, Nelsie had been seen cleaning her car with an intensity that seemed unusual. More importantly, Nelsie had looked at the neighbor and said, "Jeffrey's gone. He went to New York. He has a new girlfriend. He's not coming back." She spoke of him in the past tense before the world even knew he was dead. As the pieces of the forensic puzzle fell into place, the investigators realized they weren't dealing with a woman who had snapped once. They were looking at a woman who viewed the men in her life as disposable property. If they tried to leave, she didn't just let them go. She took them apart. But as the arrest warrants were being prepared, a new question surfaced. If Nelsie had been this violent for this long, how many other times had she lashed out? The search through her past would reveal a terrifying history of near misses. Incidents where Jeffrey and others had narrowly escaped the blade, only to be drawn back into her web. The detectives were about to uncover the true nature of the 10-year war that Jeffrey Albertsman had been fighting, a war that he had finally, tragically lost. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. To understand the final moments in the house on North Street, investigators had to look back at the decade of domestic terror that preceded it. The relationship between Jeffrey Albertsman and Nelsie Tetley was not merely toxic. It was a masterclass in predatory control. As detectives pored over Volusia County court records, a pattern emerged of a man who was desperately trying to untangle himself from a web, and a woman who viewed his independence as a personal affront punishable by blood. This wasn't a sudden explosion of violence in 2017. It was the inevitable conclusion of a narrative that had been written in police reports for years. The first major fracture documented by the state occurred in 2013. By this time, Jeffrey had already begun to realize the depth of Nelsie's volatility. He had reached a breaking point and made a move that many victims of domestic abuse find the hardest to take. He fled. Jeffrey checked himself into a local hotel, keeping his location a secret in an attempt to find the peace and safety that had become impossible in Nelsie's presence. But Nelsie did not accept the ending of her stories. She tracked him down, hunting him from his home to the hotel room where he thought he was safe. When she arrived, she didn't come to talk or to plead for a second chance. According to police reports, the encounter was immediate and violent. She cornered Jeffrey and discharged a canister of pepper spray directly into his face, blinding and disorienting him in the confined space of the hotel room. As he struggled to breathe and see, she escalated the attack. She produced a kitchen knife, the very tool that would later become her signature, and plunged it into his abdomen. Jeffrey was rushed to the hospital with a stab wound that nearly took his life 4 years before the bathroom on North Street ever would. Nelsie was arrested, but the legal system's response was a harbinger of the tragedy to come. She was sentenced to a mere 2 years of probation. In the wake of the 2013 stabbing, Jeffrey attempted to rebuild. Yet, as is common in the cycle of high-conflict domestic abuse, the honeymoon phase and the psychological grip Nelsie held over him eventually drew him back in. By 2016, the two were once again entangled, and the violence returned with a renewed, chilling specificity. During a heated argument that year, Nelsie didn't just strike Jeffrey. She gave him a verbal blueprint of his own demise. Witnesses and police records indicate she looked him in the eye and stated with absolute calm, "I could kill you tonight if I wanted." She then proceeded to beat him with both of her hands, an assault that once again landed her in front of a judge. And once again, the consequences failed to match the escalation of her threats. She received more probation and a fine. To the courts, she was an aging woman in a volatile relationship. To Jeffrey, She was a predator who was openly announcing her intentions. These records prove that Jeffrey wasn't living in a state of ignorance. He was living in a state of siege. He knew what she was capable of because she had already shown him, and she had already told him that his life was a gift she could revoke at any time. Psychologically, the dynamic was one of total surveillance. Neighbors described Nelsie as controlling and always watching. She didn't just live with Jeffrey, she hovered over his life. She knew his schedule, his bank balance, and the sound of his door. This level of obsession explains why, in 2017, when she realized Jeffrey was finally moving beyond her reach, she opted for the ultimate form of possession. If she could not control his movements, she would end them. If she could not have him in her life, she would literally take him apart. The dismemberment, seen through this psychological lens, takes on an even darker meaning. Forensic psychologists often note that post-mortem mutilation can be an attempt to dehumanize the victim or to exercise a final, absolute authority over them. By removing Jeffrey's limbs and scattering them in the fernery, Nelsie wasn't just hiding evidence. She was asserting that even in death, he belonged to her, to be moved, hidden, or discarded at her whim. It was the final act of a woman who had spent 10 years trying to break a man's spirit, only to settle for breaking his body. The most disturbing realization for the detectives was the practice Nelsie appeared to have. The 2013 stabbing was a strike to the torso. The 2017 murder was a shot to the head followed by surgical-style dismemberment. She had evolved. She had learned from her past arrests how to be more efficient, how to minimize a struggle, and how to dispose of what she no longer wanted. She had used the legal system's leniency as a training ground, and Jeffrey had paid the ultimate price for the gaps in that system. As 2017 turned into 2018, the state of Florida finally had enough to lock the door on Nelsie Tetley. But as she was led away in handcuffs, the woman who had spent a decade talking, threatening, and controlling suddenly went silent. A new battle was beginning. Not one of knives and pepper spray, but one of mental health evaluations and legal maneuvers that would stretch on for nearly a decade. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. By 2018, Nelsie Tetley was no longer a shadow in Jeffrey Albertsman's life. She was a defendant in the Florida judicial system. However, as the gavel prepared to fall, the case entered a labyrinth of legal and medical delays that would test the resolve of the Volusia County prosecutors and the patience of the grieving families. For a woman who had spent decades meticulously managing the lives and deaths of the men around her, the courtroom became her new stage, and her weapon of choice was her own mind. Following her indictment for first-degree murder, the standard legal proceedings ground to a halt as the question of competency took center stage. In the state of Florida, a defendant must understand the nature of the charges against them and be able to assist in their own defense. In 2021, a psychological evaluation initially suggested that Nelsie demonstrated the necessary mental capacity to stand trial. The state prepared for a high-profile prosecution that would finally address the 2017 murder and the haunting parallels to the 2007 cold case. But the clarity was short-lived. By April 2022, the narrative shifted dramatically. Defense experts presented findings that Nelsie's mental health had deteriorated to a point of no return. Reports from the court claimed she appeared disoriented during proceedings, exhibiting inappropriate behavior in the presence of her own counsel. She reportedly struggled to comprehend the gravity of the legal process, leading a judge to rule her mentally unfit for trial. The state was forced to pivot, and Nelsie was ordered into the custody of the Department of Children and Families, DCF. However, this transition was far from smooth. In June 2023, a legal battle erupted between the DCF and the Florida Circuit Court. The department petitioned to quash the order for her involuntary commitment, arguing a technical point of law. For a defendant to be committed for restoration, there must be a substantial probability that they will actually regain competency in the foreseeable future. If a defendant is deemed not likely restorable, the state cannot simply hold them indefinitely in a treatment facility under criminal statutes. This left Nelsie in a legal gray area, too dangerous to release, yet potentially too mentally broken to ever face a jury. Throughout 2024 and 2025, the case remained a fixture on the Volusia County docket, characterized by dozens of entries but very little movement toward a verdict. Every few months, Nelsie would undergo a new evaluation, a repetitive cycle of psychiatric assessments meant to determine if her disorientation was a genuine medical decline or a calculated performance. While she sat in specialized facilities, the memory of Jeffrey Albertsman began to fade from the headlines, replaced by the technicalities of forensic psychiatry. As of January 2026, the status of Nelsie Tetley remains one of confinement without closure. She is currently in her mid-70s, residing in a state-mandated mental health facility where she continues to receive treatment intended to restore her competency. The most recent court activity, occurring as recently as early January 2026, confirms that she remains under medical supervision, with a critical status hearing scheduled for April of this year. The question looming over that hearing is the same one that has haunted the case for years. Will she ever stand in front of a judge and answer for what happened in the bathroom on North Street? For the family of Michael Lewis, whose case has remained associated, but never officially charged due to these delays, the passage of time is a cruel adversary. The evidence of the matching manual dismemberments and the anatomical precision of the cuts remains in the files, waiting for a trial that may never happen. In the eyes of the law, Nelsie Tetley is a patient. In the eyes of the detectives who saw the body camera footage in 2017, she remains a predator who successfully outran the clock. The story of Jeffrey Albertsman ends not with a sentencing, but with a lingering silence. The house on North Street has long since been cleared, and the fernery has seen years of new growth. But the justice system remains paralyzed by a woman who, even in her 70s, retains a final, frustrating control over the narrative. As April 2026 approaches, the world waits to see if the widow of Volusia will finally be forced to face the reality of her actions, or if the truth will remain buried as deeply as the secrets she kept for a decade. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, empathy, and respect for those who can no longer speak for themselves. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button and comment your thoughts below. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.